All right, good morning, everybody. How we doing? It's great to have you here in the sanctuary this morning for a special Bible study hour by our guest preacher, Reverend Dr. Kloa. Dr. Kloa had both Zach and myself at seminary. He taught us some New Testament exegetics. At my particular class with you was Acts and the Pauline epistles, and it was amazing. This man is filled with much godly wisdom. It's going to be a great hour of class. And who would ever thought that a Cubs and a Cards fan can get along so well together? So we'll talk about that rivalry probably later on this afternoon at the... No rivalry anymore, yes. Yeah, the Cardinals are going down in the tank and the Cubs are ascending. Maybe the end times are coming. So... Let's pray. Let's pray as we go to God in prayer. Gracious God, I thank you, Lord, for the heart and for the gifts for your servant Jeff Kloa and the blessing he is to your church. Lord, I thank you for the blessings that he brings to your people here in Walberg, that he brings toward us today. And Lord, would you just continue to work in and through him in the many ways that he is serving your church actively right now. Would you continue to bless us with the power, strength, and the truth of your word? It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Start with this. There we go. Okay. Well, good morning, and the Lord be with you. It's a Lutheran audience, right? You guys know the phrase. That's how it works. Yeah, thanks for having me down for the day. I was in St. Louis and then on my way to Phoenix, so this kind of worked kind of on the way, I guess you'd say. But good to be here in Texas. What I'd like to walk through a bit today is a bit on archaeology and the New Testament. And specifically today, since we're getting close to Lent, some of the details of Jesus' passion in Jerusalem that we can kind of get a better understanding of archaeologically. There's a very large field, of course, and literally touches every page of the Bible. So we can spend a lot of time on this and a lot of pretty interesting things, but I think we'll focus on that last week in Jerusalem. And just a little background, if you don't know me, I was at Concordia Seminary for a number of years teaching New Testament, and then for a number of years at Museum of the Bible, so that's where a lot of this comes from and interaction with that, and so it's just kind of fun to pull it together and walk through it. The photo actually on the screen is, well, it was on the screen, oh there it is Ephesus, the amphitheater in Ephesus. If you've ever been there, it's an amazing place to visit. And this is the scene, the actual place where in Acts 19, Paul is hauled before the entire city and a riot breaks out with Paul, being yelled at essentially by about 12,000 people in this amphitheater because he preached the gospel in Ephesus. And as a result, people stopped buying the little silver trinkets, the statues of the goddess Artemis of Ephesus. And it put the silversmiths out of business. So it caused a riot because the preaching of the gospel led people to do something different. But that's the amphitheater. You can walk down the road that Paul was chased down to get to the amphitheater. And so it's what I hope to get at today is a little bit of...
I want to see if that's on. Nope, not on.
Oh, not on.
That way you won't have to hold this. There we go. Now you're good.
Modern technology. There it is. Okay. Yeah, how we can read the Bible, you might say, in 3D by getting an understanding of archaeology and how it really fleshes out the Bible. So to introduce this, I want to start with a passage from 1 John. It kind of gives a bit of a framework for this. John, of course, one of the disciples of Jesus, and this is how he opens his first letter. It says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest. We have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ." So notice how John starts this, right? He's not just kind of preaching a message of ideas or fables, right? It's things that he saw, he touched, He heard, right, physical things that when God came to save his creation, he came as a human being into our space, into our time, and people saw him, people touched him, right? And we can then see the places where he went, see the kinds of things that he did, the kind of things that he interacted with, as to help us understand this message of good news in him. 2 Peter has a similar theme here. He says, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Right? So again, Jesus was in the flesh, right? Eyewitnesses of his majesty. It's not just made up stories. Okay? And last from Luke 1. Luke is the evangelist of the four who kind of gives us the most foundation or basis for how he's going to write his gospel. And so he says right in the opening of his gospel, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed to us by those who were from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word." So with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So again, this eyewitness theme, right? That people saw Jesus with their own eyes. They heard from him, and these things are then passed down, handed down. So what can archaeology do and what can it not do? I think we need to just kind of get a clear sense of what you can sort of prove archaeologically and what you can't. So archaeology is really just looking at the material remains of a culture. So you're looking at things like clay, stone, sometimes wood survives, sometimes fabric survives, right? But you're looking at tangible objects, physical objects that have survived over, let's say these 2,000 years since the time of Jesus, okay? And so these are, as physical objects, again, they provide a bit of 3D for the texts, right? When Jesus goes before Pilate on trial, what kind of building was he in, right? When Paul is hauled before the leaders in Philippi, what does a Roman forum look like, right? When Jesus is crucified, what did that look like? Okay, what were the practices of the Romans? Okay, and archaeology, you have to keep in mind, doesn't stand on its own. Okay, again, archaeology is just stones in the ground or pottery or something. You need some context to understand it. So archaeologists always work with writings and descriptions that are contemporary to that time. To make sense of it. One good example, there's recent in the last, I'd say 3 years, I think this has been, accepted. There's a project that we sponsored at the museum of an excavation of a site called Bethsaida in the northern shore of Galilee. And if you look at old maps of the New Testament, often they will have a question mark next to Bethsaida on the map. It's somewhere on the north of Galilee, but they weren't quite sure where. And one town was identified, but it's kind of up on a hill, and it didn't really make sense of a fishing village. So one archaeologist decided that there's probably a better location, did some test excavations, and read actually writings from the 5th and 6th century of people who were going along the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, and picked a spot, and sure enough found a Roman city, found a Byzantine basilica, and probably built over, again, according to tradition, the home of Peter, St. Peter, who's from Bethsaida. Keep in mind, there's no road signs. When you come down the road to Bethsaida, there's no sign that says Bethsaida, right? Somebody has to figure out where it is and then try to make sense of the material that you find in the ground. So we're still, finding new things, still getting a sharper picture of the New Testament and its world, and indeed the ministry of Jesus. Now, one thing archaeology can't do, just to be clear, is it can't provide evidence for events or actions. So, for example, with the crucifixion of Jesus, we can look at Roman crucifixion practices archaeologically and in textual descriptions and see that what's described of Jesus in the Gospels is exactly the same, right? I mean, down to the nails, literally. Jesus' crucifixion looks like a Roman crucifixion. Now, does that mean that it actually happened? Archaeology can't prove that. All it can prove is that this is how Romans did crucifixions, and the Gospels match that. You see the difference, right? You can't prove an event because you don't have a video recorder. All you have are inscriptions, texts, material remains left behind, and then they help us understand. And a word I like to use is they kind of provide coherence, right? They show that both the Old Testament and the New Testament fit within the culture that they're describing, right? It's not like, Jesus is walking along and suddenly he, says, "Go Cubs," or something, right? It doesn't happen because the Cubs aren't around yet. So it provides that framework within which it makes sense. So that's what I want to walk through a bit today is how do the archaeological remains help us understand the Gospels and make sense of them. So a little background here. Oops, we lost the map. There we go. Probably can't see that very well, but how many of you have been to Israel, to the Holy Land? Yeah, it's a really amazing experience. The thing you got to keep in mind about the Holy Land is that map from the bottom of Idumea there, the yellow, up to, Caesarea Philippi. It's about 70 miles. Now, this whole area is about the size of New Jersey, and it's about as attractive. No, I'm just kidding. It's really not that pretty a place. It's kind of desert, right? And at the time of Jesus, of course, it was split into different governing areas. So Judea and Samaria were one Roman province, which was under direct imperial control, meaning they didn't allow local leaders like they did elsewhere in the Roman Empire, but it was a border area. They had trouble with the Parthians over here. This is literally the edge of the Roman Empire right here. And so they wanted to keep the border safe. And the Jewish population tended to rebel. So the emperor appointed a governor directly. It was an imperial province. Now, up north in Galilee, one of Herod's kids was allowed to continue to rule because it wasn't that important an area. It didn't have the kind of political problems that you had down in Jerusalem. So Herod, right, Herod Antipas is up in this area, and then you get these other kind of political regions, right? So Jesus is navigating kind of a political reality as he's moving back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem. You see Capernaum up here, Jerusalem down here, and Samaritans in the middle, which comes up, of course, in say, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, so that's our you might say sandbox in which the Gospels occur, and it's a very politically challenging time. Won't go into a lot of detail here, but for a brief period, around 160 BC until 63 BC, the people of Israel, the Israelites, Judeans actually, had independence. They were not part of any Greek Empire, Roman Empire, but as Rome expanded in 63 BC, they came in, just kind of took the place over with their army, and so now you are under Roman political rule. And the thing to keep in mind about this is you're kind of Jewish, but also kind of Roman at the same time. It's kind of like in the world today, right? If you travel to, I don't know, go to Europe, right? And you're going to find a McDonald's. You're going to find a Starbucks, right? You're going to find people wearing basically the same kind of clothes, right? We're in kind of a cosmopolitan shared culture. And that's one of the challenges that happens with the people of Judea, because they are trying to follow the Torah and the covenant that God gave them, but having to deal with the Romans. And they don't have a king. And they have to pay taxes to a foreign government. And they have a lot of Gentiles around, these non-Jews who they didn't have before, right? And so they're dealing with, kind of multiculturalism in a way, and trying to sort out, well, how do we survive as a people, and how do we survive religiously in this very strange environment? And so we see this interplay quite a bit between Jewish culture, Roman culture, and the conflict that resulted. Now here's a photo from, and I'm going to start now with the entrance into Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, just to get a feel for what that looks like. We're here looking at the Mount of Olives, down into the Kidron Valley, and then up slightly, you see the Dome of the Rock here. That's the site of the temple that was built by Herod the Great, previously the site of Solomon's temple about 900 years previously. So when Jesus comes over the Mount of Olives on Palm Sunday, and you have the crowds gathered who are saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest. We have to remember that the people who are praising Jesus on this Palm Sunday are not people from Jerusalem. They're the Jews who have come literally from around the world to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. And in Jerusalem in the first century, you don't have a Hilton, you don't have a Sheraton, you don't have hotels, right? So what do people do? They camp on the hillsides outside Jerusalem and go into Jerusalem for certain elements of the Passover festival, especially the command to eat the lamb inside the city walls, okay, which you see with Jesus on Last Supper. So the reason that's significant, again, is the people on the hillside are people from Galilee, all over the place. People have, as we can tell, have heard Jesus and seen Jesus teaching. But inside Jerusalem itself, you have the temple and the temple leaders and people who basically work for the temple. So the people shouting, "Crucify, crucify," on Friday are people connected to the temple whose job Jesus is threatening, and not the same people who on Palm Sunday were praising him just a few days earlier, right? Completely different group of people, completely different interests, and as we see in the Gospels, the temple authorities very much wanted to keep their authority, right? And so here's a model of first century Jerusalem, pretty well done model. This is in Jerusalem itself. And you can see here the platform that was the base for the temple built by Herod, okay? And then you've got the stoa here. So again, the Kidron Valley runs down, and as you can tell, and let me give you another photo here. Here's a drawing. The temple platform itself dominates Jerusalem, physically, economically, politically. Jerusalem is not on any rivers. It's not on any trade routes. There's no reason for Jerusalem to exist except David and Solomon, and really that's it. That's the only reason it exists. And so its entire economy, its entire reason for existing is this temple. And so not surprisingly, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem, most of his interactions are around that temple. And the first thing that he does, of course, is overturn the tables of the money changers. Now, what's happening here is you had to pay a temple tax every year to the temple in Jerusalem. And when you wanted to purchase an animal for sacrifice, you had to use a certain currency to do that. According to the Torah, it had to be pure silver, and the purest silver coin at that time was the Tyrian shekel, the shekel minted in Tyre, up north on the coast of the Mediterranean. So it was known to be the purest coin, and when you brought your family down for the Passover, needed to sacrifice for a newborn, like we saw with Jesus and Mary and Joseph, you had to change your currency into this money in order to navigate the temple. Now here's the problem, right? Every time you change money, what happens? Exactly, right? You've done this before. You lose, right? And so lots of opportunity for funny business with the temple, right? So Jesus is upset about a lot of things, right? You've turned my house from a house of prayer, right, into a den of thieves. They're stealing even as they're changing money, right? Just the way it works. The other place these coins come up is when Judas is paid 30 pieces of silver. He's paid, of course, by temple authorities who pay in temple currency 30 pieces of silver, right? That's the money that Judas was paid to betray Jesus. In our exhibit at Museum of the Bible, we had a good relationship with the Israel Antiquities Authority, the archaeological organization for Israel. They do a lot of work, really talented people. And so we had, a whole bunch of archaeology from Old Testament period, New Testament period. And in the display, we had a little pile of Tyrian shekels, right? And I didn't know this at first, but a couple years after we opened, I was walking through the gallery with somebody from Israel, one of the curators there. And he said, "Jeff, do you know how many silver coins are in your gallery case?" I said, "It's probably 30, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah, it's 30. Little inside joke, right? 30 pieces of silver. Good people, but yeah, this is the currency they wanted to use. And it's interesting because, again, this is the problem of being Jewish in a multicultural environment. Notice the figure on the coin is Hercules. He's the guy pictured on the coin. But if you know your 10 commandments, especially as they're observed by the Jews, what's one of the commandments? Yeah, no graven image, to use the old King James, right? No images. And so if you go to throughout Israel, the mosaics and things, they won't have images of people or animals in observance of that commandment. But when it comes to pay the temple tax, that's the silver coin that was purest, so that's what they used, right? Again, they have to kind of bend, right, to meet the current environment, which is one of the challenges. I want to skip ahead to the Last Supper. Yep, so I'm going backwards here. Yeah. Last Supper, we know, did not look like Leonardo da Vinci's painting. No table, no silverware, no staging, not all facing the camera, right? When you ate a meal in the Roman Empire, especially a fancy meal, in fact, Luke tells us that when Jesus met with his disciples, as they were reclining, remember that? He says to them, well, that's how you eat a banquet in the Roman world. You recline. You have couches, and you have food brought to you, and you eat on these kind of communal platters, right? So Jesus was certainly not sitting in chairs. He's eating around this well, there's a couple ways it could be done, but this is maybe a most likely way it was done. And then, again, they're passing the cup around, passing the herbs around, the wine. We have a pretty good idea of what the Passover sequence looked like. We have some evidence from 3rd century texts of what the Passover was. It's actually a very long, anybody ever observed a Passover or participated in? Yes, it's a pretty long event. And it's a recounting of God saving the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt. So you've got the, where are we? Oh. I lost it. Anyway, you've got the story of the Passover, a couple Psalms of praise. You have several cups. There's actually 4 cups. But you've got the words over the bread, then the meal, and then the cup after supper, right, as you know from the communion liturgy, and then another hymn of praise, and then a final cup, and they leave. So an extended period. Now, again, the teaching in the Torah, in the Old Testament, was that you had to eat the Passover, if possible, in Jerusalem. So the Passover lambs had to be sacrificed. There was a whole kind of assembly line system for this to work. You bought your lamb from the temple, and then you rented a house or rented a room in Jerusalem to eat the meal. Okay, again, because you don't have restaurants, you don't have hotels. And so, again, when Jesus asks his disciples to prepare the Passover, he sends them ahead to go find a room, right, to rent a room for the Passover. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, they will show you the room of the Last Supper. Unfortunately, the building that they show you did not exist in the 1st century. So probably not the place Jesus ate his Last Supper. In fact, it looked very much like this. And this actually gets a little bit to the nativity story. In residences in that part of the world, you had kind of a courtyard area, a couple rooms off for sleeping, And then notice this, I lost my clicker. There it is. Okay. See it says storage room, right? And then these stairs going up, and you see the word upper room, right? That's where Jesus would have had a Last Supper, in the upper room, right? And that's where the family would have slept, where they would have taken their meals, and where they celebrated this Passover. This also helps us understand the Christmas story. It's not quite what you have pictured in your heads. I know in Christmas you think of a wooden stable, right, and the animals and everything. And in the King James and most modern translations will say, right, she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, problem is that Greek word does not mean inn. It literally means upper room. Same exact word of where Jesus eats the Last Supper, in an upper room. And so the Christmas story actually would have been in a place like this. The lower storage area where the animals would have slept at night, the manger would have been down there, because the residence where they would have stayed, again, because there's no hotels in Bethlehem, right? No room in the upper room, and so she laid him in a manger. So it's okay, you can still keep your nativity sets, you don't need to redo them. But it's a much more cozy kind of scene, right? They're with family because it's the census, right? That's what happens when you travel. You meet your family, and they're down in this little storage room. Now, when we get to the trial, this is where things get really pretty interesting archaeologically and politically. So the first trial, of course, is at the chief priest's house after he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's a courtyard. And if you get to Jerusalem, there's a part of the upper city, the Jewish quarter today, where they've been able to excavate some of the houses from the Roman period that were owned by the priestly families. And again, the economy in Jerusalem was the temple, and so the wealthy people in Jerusalem were the priests. It's kind of how it worked. So they excavated a villa, is what it's called, and in the upper city from the first century. Inscriptions on the house itself indicate that it's a member of a priestly clan from that time. And it's a 6,000 square foot house, by the way. These people had means, right? Courtyards, the whole thing. But there's obviously this isn't the house where it happened, but it's a good parallel to Caiaphas' house. You have kind of a courtyard area, kind of like we saw in that previous photo, but nicer and paved. And then you had some stairs up and kind of a platform a little bit. And that was kind of your public room, and that was open to the courtyard. So you've got the scene where Peter is, if you recall, sitting at the fire, and people are saying, well, you were with this Jesus, right? And Jesus is with Caiaphas on trial. And you remember how that works, where the third time Peter denies, Jesus looks at him, right? Well, that's what's happening. Jesus is up in his public room, and Peter's down in the courtyard, and he denies the third time, and Jesus can see him from that room. And you've got this contrast between Peter on trial, in a sense, with like low people, right, servants, and he can't pass it. Jesus is on trial with the most important people in Jerusalem, and he passes, right? And they're juxtaposed to each other. They're within sight of each other as this is happening. It's kind of a poignant place to be, to imagine that scene with Jesus looking at Peter. And of course, the charge of Peter was that he was with Jesus, and he can't even acknowledge that much, right? He's too afraid. Now, where archaeology helps us here is with these things called ossuaries. Now, ossuaries are a burial practice from really only the area of Judea, and really only from about 50 BC to about 100 AD is when they had this practice. And the practice was, you're probably familiar from the Gospels, a person would die, they would wrap the body in a cloth with spices, place it in a tomb that could be entered and left again. The family would come back 1 year later on the anniversary of the death, gather the bones after the flesh had decayed. That's why they needed the spices. And then put the bones in what's called an ossuary. Literally a bone box is literally what it means in Greek. And then these ossuaries would be gathered into these family crypts. So you'd have kind of generations of families in these ossuaries. Well, this particular ossuary, it's in the Israel Museum today in Jerusalem, is one of the most important discovered because it has an inscription on the side of it, that rough inscription that says Joseph ben Caiaphas. Joseph ben Caiaphas. So Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And we know from other texts as well as from the Gospels that he was high priest at this time for Jesus' trial. Now, when archaeologists find these things in Jewish culture, they have to respect the bones, so they preserve these carefully. But there were human remains inside the ossuary, and there's no doubt, based on the location, the family that he's buried with, the cost of the ossuary, you notice how it's ornately carved, and the name, they actually have the bones of Joseph Caiaphas. And they found the guy, right? Really, to date, still the only biblical person whose remains they actually have found, physical remains, which is pretty remarkable. Now,
How big is that box?
it's not very large. Generally, the longest bone is the tibia, so it's generally about the size of the longest bone. It's about that large. Made out of sandstone, all hand carved. And I should have explained, it's very expensive, professionally carved, obviously, with the front, with the rosette designs. Notice no animals or people, again, because it's Jewish. But the kind of chicken scratch you get on the side, that's because the family came back a year later and put him in the box, right? That wasn't professionally done. And every one of these that have been discovered, that's how it works. Somebody scratched a name in. And in some cases, there's 3 or 4 people buried in the same box. You'll have 3 or 4 names on the box. Again, there's literally thousands of these that has been discovered. We had, I think, 8 or 10 on display at the museum. They did find one, just a note, they did find one about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, that claimed to have an inscription saying, James, brother of Jesus. Remember that story, the James ossuary years ago? Big hoo-ha, put it on exhibit, all these kinds of things. Well, it turned out it was faked. Guy carved the brother of Jesus into the stone, and turned out to be a forgery. When the police arrested him, it was literally sitting on his toilet. So it's probably not real. But this one, again, they found in context, which is key. They found it in the tomb, amongst other ones, so it was verified to be authentic and actually true. Yeah, lots of forgeries, unfortunately, in the archaeology world. Now, the second trial of Jesus occurs in the Temple Stoa. And, oops, I keep going backwards here. The Temple Stoa is this kind of series of columns here on the south end of the temple platform. And that's where the Sanhedrin met, where you had kind of the religious business conducted. So now you're moving from Caiaphas' house in the upper city of Jerusalem, across that little valley in Jerusalem, now to the Temple Stoa, and now you have a bigger group, all right? And here's the key charge again. Remember, what was the charge against Jesus? Why was he actually crucified? Well, blasphemy, that was the religious leaders' charge, right? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up, right? Caiaphas flat out asks him, right, are you the one? And Jesus says, well, I'm the Son of Man, right? Quoting Daniel. So they tear their clothes and they realize he's a blasphemer. But they don't take the charge of blasphemy to Pilate, because does Pilate care about religious issues? So what was the charge they brought to Pilate? Claimed to be a king, right? Claimed to be a king. So Pilate asks him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Right? And of course, Jesus says, "You got the wrong kind of king going on here." But what's the charge written above him? Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, right? So when the religious leaders wanted to get him crucified, knew that blasphemy wasn't going to do anything. You had to charge him with insurrection. All right? You had to charge him with a political crime so that the Romans would get involved, because the Jewish population didn't have the right of putting people to death. Only the Romans could do that. And in fact, only the emperor or people appointed by the emperor could order a crucifixion. Not even kind of normal politicians could order a crucifixion. So they knew what they had to do to get it done. So for Pilate, and now to get back to our map here, for Pilate, right? Now we're going from the Temple Stoa over here. There we go, slightly. There's the Temple Stoa. Now they got to go back over here, and here's the palace used by Pontius Pilate. Actually, a good bit of this still remains. There's some remains to it. You can walk through it. And the gatehouse still remains up here. That's the Joppa Gate today, if you've been to Jerusalem. And so now they're back across to where Pilate was. Now again, we know of Pilate from other texts outside the Bible. But in 1963, I think was the year, they found in Caesarea an inscription. Now, Caesarea is on the Mediterranean, obviously. The first time I was in Israel, we did a class for seminary students. It was a lot of fun. And they're like 23 years old, so you can make them work. You can go everywhere. But we went down all the way south to Beersheba first, way down south where Abraham was from, out in the desert. And we're in this kind of not fun place for about 4 or 5 days. And then we work our way up to Caesarea and get to the Mediterranean. I'm like, why don't we just stay here the whole time? I mean, it's beautiful. And that's why Herod built his palace on the Mediterranean, right? Of course you would, Caesarea, right? And in fact, this is you might call it today an infinity pool. That's a pool that Herod built so he could look at the Mediterranean while he's bathing, right? Well, when Herod and his family lost the right to rule Judea, and Herod appointed governors, of course the governors lived in Herod's palace. Of course you're going to do that. It's beautiful on the coast of Caesarea. And we know something about Pilate. These buttons are confusing me. Here we go. Because they discovered in 1963 an inscription that was placed on a building that Pilate paid for. So one of the things you did if you were a wealthy Roman was you dedicated buildings or you dedicated statues, right? And you put your name on it. And so here, and you can pretty much read this. This Tiberium, so it's a temple to the Emperor Tiberius, was built, and you can kind of make it out here, Pilatus. You see that there? Pilatus. You see the end of Pontius Pilate. Well, Pontius Pilate paid for this temple in Caesarea. Again, direct archaeological evidence for the guy who ultimately put Jesus to death. So again, these charges brought against Jesus reflect this political situation, right? He's misleading our nation, right? That's one of the charges. So a political charge. He's forbidding tribute to Caesar. Well, what do the Romans care about? Don't rebel and pay your taxes. That's pretty much every government, right? Don't rebel and pay your taxes. So if Jesus is forbidding tribute to Caesar, which he wasn't, but again, that was a claim made against him. And here's, of course, your coin of Caesar. Now, this is a gold aureus, of course. And you see here Caesar Augustus around the outside. And Pontifex Maximus is the title of the emperor. That is, the emperor is the kind of gateway between the human world and the spiritual world. The emperor is sort of the mediator between those places. And so he can be called Son of God, right? One of the titles of the Roman emperor was Son of God. They adopted this early on as a kind of little bit of humility, like I'm not a god, I'm just a son of a god. By the time you get to the 80s and 90s, they just stopped calling themselves son of God and just called themselves gods. So that's when Christianity had troubles, because can you make sacrifices to the emperor as God and still be a Christian? This is where the persecutions come in the 2nd, 3rd century. We'll get to those in a little bit here. Okay, and then the other charges. Caiaphas has to explain to Pilate what these Hebrew words mean. So he is Messiah, the Hebrew word for the anointed one, Christos in Greek, right, Jesus Christ. And then he translates it for Pilate. He's a Messiah that is for you a king, right? You think it's just a Hebrew word, a religious word, but it's actually a political word. So again, they're playing all the political cards here. And he stirs up the people with his teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee to Jerusalem. So the whole area is under threat, right? And so again, it's not a challenge really to the position of the emperor. I mean, the emperor's in Rome, right? He doesn't even know what's going on. But it's a threat to Herod and Pilate. If you don't take care of this, word is going to get back to Rome. And you're going to be the one who's in trouble. And you remember the last phrase they use? If you don't do this, you are not a friend of Caesar, right? I hate to tell you that's mob terminology, right? Caesar's the boss, and you have to follow him. And if you're not doing what Caesar would do, then you're not a friend of Caesar. Right? So again, these political claims. And their argument is, of course, the Sanhedrin are loyal subjects to Rome. Jesus is not. Okay. So what does the crucifixion itself look like? It's adopted in the 1st century. Oops. There we go. It's adopted first in the 1st century, BC. It wasn't a practice before then among Romans. And initially, the purpose wasn't to put people to death. It was just to humiliate people. So they would strip them of their clothes, hang them on this cross on the side of a major road outside of a city, and people were supposed to mock them and see them as an example. Don't do what this person did. After a while, they decided that, well, you might as well just kill them because we don't want these people around anyway. So at first, they only permitted crucifixion for slaves. The famous revolt of Spartacus, if you know that one, they killed a bunch of slaves. Then they were allowed to kill foreign captives and conquered enemies. And unfortunately for Jesus, the Jewish population fits into that category of conquered enemies, right? So they could be crucified, Roman citizens could not, right? So again, the Spartacus slave rebellion, 6,000 crucifixions on the road from out of Rome down to the south of Italy. In 7 AD, Varus crucified 2,000 Jews after a rebellion. And after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, some 40 years after the time of Jesus, Titus, the Roman general, crucified up to 500 Jewish people a day. So it became a kind of a standard practice, brutal practice, to try to keep people from rebelling. Again, only the emperor had the authority, only the procurator had authority to crucify outside of Italy, so directly appointed by the emperor. And again, we see exactly what we see in the Gospels. After a condemnation, the individual is flogged, though specifically not to the point of death. You might have heard the phrase 39 lashes. So the thinking was if they got 40 lashes, they would die, so they do 39. Right? Just to be nice, right? Then, as they are made to carry the cross, and actually what they carried is the patibulum, the crossbeam, would be tied to their back, and the pole would already be in the ground, and they would carry the beam, be nailed to it, and then, pulled up and hang on the cross. As they were walking through the street carrying the crossbeam, a soldier would carry the charge against them. And in this case, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So you have this Jesus going through Jerusalem. And then at the crucifixion site, the individual would be nailed to the crossbeam and raised by ropes and crucified. So where did this happen, first of all? Well, again, here's Pilate's palace here. And the place of crucifixion, we can be pretty certain of where it was for a couple of reasons. First, we know where the Roman wall was in the first century because it's been excavated. So this is the first century wall here. Notice not far from the palace. And then there's a main gate that goes outside of it, still does. And there's a rocky hill outside there and a cemetery that's been excavated. So if you go to Jerusalem today, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Golgotha, it's kind of one big complex, but several chapters inside of that. It's exactly in this spot right here, and almost certainly that's the place of crucifixion, because it's right outside the Roman wall. It's built on a rocky hill. There's a cemetery there, and there's solid evidence that Christians were venerating the site, because after Jerusalem was destroyed in 130 by the Romans, because the Jews rebelled again, they said, forget it, we're just destroying the city. The emperor built a temple to Apollo on top of the site. So in a way, he kind of marked the spot, right, to prevent people from worshiping there. And then when Constantine came to power, his mother came to Jerusalem, and they dismantled that temple and built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over that site. So it's pretty likely that's the spot of crucifixion, and there's a graveyard right there, excavated, so pretty likely that that's where the burial was as well. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre might well be in the right spot. If you've been to the place, it's hard to envision it as a cemetery because it's a Byzantine church and very ornate and not really, Western style. But there's a little chapel that you go into, and there's a slab of marble. And about 10 years ago, National Geographic was allowed to remove the slab and do some experiments. So they took the slab off. There's another slab underneath it. And then they took that slab out, and they got to bedrock, so cemetery bedrock. And on the walls, they found candles, burn marks, and Christian graffiti, probably from the 2nd, 3rd century. So at least it was venerated as the burial place of Jesus within 100 years of his death. Now, does that mean that was the place? Maybe, maybe not, but it fits everything you would expect, right? It all fits the scenes. I know that if you go there, and sometimes they'll take you to the garden tomb, which will give you a sense of what it looked like, but probably almost certainly not the spot of burial. It's probably in that spot. Now, here's where archaeology kind of helps in a few things. Back, in the biblical scholarship 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it was very common for critics of the Bible to say that, well, the crucifixion and resurrection could not have happened because Romans never let people bury their own dead after they were crucified. What Romans would do is they would take the body down, throw it into a mass pit, and jackals would come and scatter the bones, and vultures would eat the body. And so there's no way that the Gospels are true because the Romans never let people take their dead. Completely fabricated. Well, in 1967, they were bulldozing for a parking lot in Jerusalem and came across another cluster of these crypts, family crypts with ossuaries in them. And inside one of the ossuaries was the name Yohanan, and they found that's an ankle bone, and you can see a spike driven through the ankle bone, and on the back side, there's a little bit of olive wood, right? And in the wrist bones, they found, the way they did the nails, it wasn't in the palm because there's no bone structure to hold it. They'd put the nails in the wrists, so it kind of hold there. And there were abrasion marks in the wrists of this guy, so he'd been crucified, just like the Gospels describe. And he was allowed to be buried in a family tomb, just like the Gospels describe. So once they found this, right, a Jewish man crucified by the Romans who was allowed to be buried by his family, no longer could critics say the Bible can't possibly be true because we know that Romans crucified people exactly like Jesus was crucified. So it doesn't, again, prove the crucifixion, but it fits with what we would expect of a Roman burial, a Roman crucifixion. I keep going backwards here. So here's a drawing of what this would have looked like. They didn't put the nails in the hands here, but that was one way it was often done. And then you see how the nails are through the ankle bones. That was based on that archaeological find. And the reason crucifixion was liked by the Romans is because, again, it was a public spectacle. It was a way to dissuade people from doing similar crimes. And they didn't want you to die right away. They wanted you to hang up there for several days. So this was perfectly designed, so if you stood up, your lungs would open and you could breathe, which was good, but that was very painful because you're pushing yourself up on nails in your ankle bones. But if you rested your ankles and sunk down, then your chest collapsed and you couldn't breathe. So you had this constant, getting up for air, going down, getting up for air, going down. And people didn't die from blood loss, they died from asphyxiation. Eventually they just weren't strong enough to lift themselves up, and they just died. So that's why, again, the Pilate is surprised that Jesus had already died just a few hours after being crucified, because typically they're there for several days. Right? Again, matches exactly what we'd expect from the Gospels. The first drawing of a crucifixion, by the way, is from a mid-2nd century graffiti inscription in a wall in a tomb in Rome. And you see the inscription on the left, the pencil drawing on the right. And notice you see what looks like a donkey on a cross. So being crucified, you have somebody kind of hailing the donkey. And underneath that, in Greek, it says, Alexamenos, which is the guy's name. Alexamenos worships his God. Almost certainly that's mocking Christians who are worshiping a God who was crucified. So the first depiction, archaeologically, of a crucifixion is a mockery of Christians for worshiping a crucified God, right? So when Paul talks about the foolishness of the cross in 1 Corinthians 1, this is the foolishness of the cross in the 2nd century, right? The worst possible way you could die, yet God sent his son Jesus to do that for us, right? The tomb, to finish that out, and there's examples of these that are still around today. You see the stone that rolls in front of the door, rolls back. Again, the reason you do that is so that you can access the tomb, come back later on, and remove the cloth and the spices and put the body in an ossuary. So of course, a very expensive kind of tomb, and we know that from Joseph of Arimathea, but that's what it would have looked like. Here's where they would have laid the body as the flesh was decaying in preparation to put it in an ossuary. They'd put it in these kind of niches, and then again come back on the anniversary of the death and put the bones in the ossuary. So again, exactly like is described in the Gospels. In case you were wondering, though, if you recall, when Mary and the women went to the tomb, yeah, he wasn't there, right? Just a reminder, yeah. They didn't come back and find a body, right? That's the whole point. What is striking, though, is they expected to find one, right? I mean, they do what they can on the Friday, and then the Sabbath, so the stores are closed. Sabbath, of course, goes from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. So after the Sabbath ended on Saturday night, Walmart opened again and went and bought more spices, right? And then early the next morning, they go with the spices expecting to anoint a body, right? Even though Jesus said, I'm going to rise from the dead, it just didn't register, right? They're wondering about who's going to roll away the stone and think they're going to find a dead body. Let me skip over a couple things to get to the last. Yeah, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. That's over the tomb, and that's over Golgotha. I mean, people have different piety, but it was pretty cool. When you get to the Golgotha Chapel, you kind of have to go up some steps because it's on a hill, and there's a hole, and you can place your hand in the hole and touch Calvary, touch the stone. I mean, it's kind of cool, right? A couple other quick things. This is an inscription that's in the Armenian chapel, kind of down from the Armenian chapel in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's a boat, which is an early symbol for the church in Christianity, well, still is in some cases today. And the inscription is, "Lord, we came." So again, archaeologists think this is a kind of a pilgrim who came to that site in the 2nd century and kind of left their little, Kilroy was here symbol on it. This is, I got a chance to go kind of under the sepulcher one time. It's pretty cool. And there are still these tombs kind of inside the church itself. Now, you can't go there publicly, but in the lower levels, there's still the cemetery, and that's kind of what it probably looked like. You can go inside this little niche and see how they would have done the burial practices. And again, it's right there in the spot where the church is today. Now, one last thing, and I know we got to quit here, but I thought I'd throw this in. Jumping ahead a couple of centuries. And this was a recent discovery, which I got to be a part of. This is the oldest ever discovered purpose-built Christian church. Right? So the first place of worship ever discovered, built as a church. They found this in Megiddo, up north in Galilee, inside the camp of a Roman, cohort stationed there. And it's literally inside a prison. So you see those walls in the background there, that's an Israeli prison. They were hoping to build more buildings inside the prison, uncovered some stuff, called in the archaeologists, and as they cleared this off, they found this intact floor of a church. When I was there, this was almost exactly 2 years ago. It was March of 24, and behind those walls were prisoners from Hamas, from the October 7 thing, so we had this huge security. But this looks recognizable, right? You see that center stone. There we go. That's the altar, the table for the celebration of the Eucharist. There's 3 inscriptions. This inscription indicates that a centurion named Gaius called a brother, paid for this portion of the pavement here. So here's a centurion in the Roman army paying for part of this church floor. This dedication over here commends 4 women. It doesn't say for what, but just says, we give honor to these 4 women. Were they martyrs? Were they important women in the church? We don't know. But the most important inscription is this one on the bottom here. And I think I got a close-up of it. Yeah, that's Yotam, the guy that found it, and that didn't work very well. But the inscription says, Ekeptus is the woman's name. Ekeptus Ekeptus, the God lover, is her title, offers the altar, and here's the key phrase, to God, Jesus Christ, as a memorial. Now, what's important about this is dated very specifically to 230 AD. There's lots of reasons they got that specific, which we don't need to get into. This is 100 years before Constantine, 100 years before the Nicene Creed. And again, it used to be common for scholars to say, well, people didn't really think Jesus was divine until Constantine. They invented the divinity of Jesus kind of for political reasons. Well, here you have 100 years before then, normal, everyday people, nobody famous, centurion, a church, building a floor inside a Roman camp, a church, dedicated to God, Jesus Christ. Right? It's pretty amazing. So we worked on a project with the IAA, and they conserved it, they pulled it out. It's actually on display in Washington now until, I think for another couple of months it'll be there if you want to come see it. Pretty cool process to watch them take it out and all that. It's pretty cool to be a part of it. But again, it's once something is in stone, you kind of can't gainsay it anymore, right? Right? Well, they didn't crucify people like the gospel said. Well, actually they did, right? Well, nobody said Jesus was God until the 4th century. Well, actually they did, right? And so again and again and again, it helps us see like John said, with our eyes, with our hands, right, what God did in the world for us. It's a great experience. If you haven't been to Israel and you have the chance to do it, I'd really encourage it. And go with someone who can kind of help walk through the Bible. I've done journeys of Paul trips before. That's to go to Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi. You can actually see. You could teach a whole class just in Corinth, because everything Paul describes in 1 Corinthians, the temple dining rooms, the gods that are being worshipped, the meat market where they're buying meat. You can actually go to the meat market that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 10. It's there in Corinth, right? So if you have the chance, it's a great experience to be able to, be immersed in the times, the spaces where God himself did his work among us, and be strengthened and encouraged in that. So I got to quit. Any quick questions, comments? Yeah.
Your opening slide, it appears to be the amphitheater at Ephesus.
Ephesus, exactly, right. Yeah.
We were blessed to see
Yeah.
that in October.
Yeah.
I recognize it because of the way the left side ended, but also I had to look past all the tower cranes that were standing.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing is, we had the opportunity to do a devotion in the Agora
Yeah.
under one of those massive trees. And the thing that struck me is that's all been excavated. Yet those trees, there's
Yeah. Massive.
around those trees that are probably there's 7 or 8 feet tall.
Yeah.
And so it was amazing. And now when you read Ephesus, you don't think about it, but Paul just wrote a letter to somebody.
Yeah.
He's writing a letter to people that
We live there. Yeah. Yeah. And Corinth, you get to Philippi, you get the same experience. It's just, we usually don't think of the epistles as archaeologically grounded or whatever, but, or the book of Acts. The book of Acts, you could spend hours and hours going through the archaeology of Acts. It really helps understand the book very well. But again, these are real people, right? The gospel is preached to actual people in actual times and places, and God did his work, in our world. Yeah. Thank you.
As we close, one of the things that I'm continuously reminded about when it comes to archaeology is also Jesus, great issuing this statement: even the rocks, even the stones will cry out and testify of who I am. Archaeology tells a story, and it actually brings us in to the narrative of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much for sharing with us through the pictures. Thank you for coming today. We've actually got a hearty group of travelers that are getting ready to go with Pastor Dave and myself and our wives to Israel here in a couple months.
Nice.
We're going in about 60 days or so, about 25
Nice.
of us that are heading out from this congregation. So
Yeah.
you'll see some of this stuff on our trip, and obviously some of the stuff they say, this is where this happened, we'll be putting some gentle disclaimers out there. It's not exactly right there.
Well, if you're interested, I'm doing another Journeys of Paul cruise in next May, I think it is, or next March. And it's great because, we start in Rome, you go to Malta, you go to Athens, you go to Corinth, then you go to Santorini. Not where Paul went, but it's a nice place to visit anyway, so it's good.
Thank you very
Anyway,
much
thank
for
you.
being here with us today. And the Lord's blessings to you as you head off on your day, or whether you'll join us for late church if you haven't been to worship yet. Thanks for joining us today, and God's blessings on the rest of your Sunday.